The U.S. administration seems ready to move to the next phase of the global war on terror. What would that phase look like? We'll find out next on The Line. This is On The Line, and I'm Aisha Tanseem. For the last 12 years, the U.S. has been waging a global war on terror, and for a while, it seemed like this would last forever. But in a major policy speech last week, President Obama indicated that it was time to wind down.
This war, like all wars, must end. That's what history advises. That's what our democracy demands.
Joining me in studios to talk about the implications of the speech and the strategy President Obama laid down, I have Andrea Prasow, Senior Counterterrorism Counsel at the Human Rights Watch, and Lawrence Haas, former Communications Director for the Clinton White House and now a Senior Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. Welcome to the show. Starting with you, Mr. Haas, do you think President Obama laid down a clear strategy for the way forward?
I think it's a very clear strategy. I think it's an incomplete one, however. He cannot declare an end to this war unilaterally because obviously America's enemies have not declared an end to this war. And I was very struck by the fact that he really did not define the nature of the enemy, in essence, which is radical Islam. He never mentions it in his speech. And he never mentions one of the driving forces behind this war, which is state-sponsored terrorism. I don't think you can legitimately talk about terrorism and not talk about the most aggressive state sponsor of terrorism in the world, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. So I found the speech rather incomplete. He wants to narrow this engagement, but I worry that those who are our adversaries have no intention of narrowing it.
Do you agree, Andrea? Do you think that he didn't define the enemy? Didn't he say Al-Qaeda we're defeating Al-Qaeda, but now we have these targeted people that we need to attack?
You know, I don't think it's possible for there to be a war against radical Islam, and if that's what the U.S. actually thinks it's engaged in, I think we have a very big problem. But I do think that it was helpful that the president did attempt to identify the nature of the enemy. He didn't say the war is against terror or terrorism. He said it's against Al-Qaeda. However, he said it's against Al-Qaeda and its associated forces, and we don't know who those people are and how they're determined to be associated with Al-Qaeda.
Okay, now before I move forward, I want you to hear in his own words how he tried to limit it. So let's hear what President Obama said about it.
In the years to come, not every collection of thugs that labels themselves Al-Qaeda will pose a credible threat to the United States. Unless we discipline our thinking, our definitions, our actions, we may be drawn into more wars we don't need to fight, or continue to grant presidents unbound powers more suited for traditional armed conflicts between nation states.
So not every thug is Al-Qaeda, Lawrence. He says we cannot be fighting forever.
Oh, I think that's right. And there are going to be differences in terms of the abilities of these terrorist groups, or thugs as he puts it, in terms of whether they can actually threaten U.S. interests, threaten Western interests around the world. So I think he's right about that. There will be a lot of claims of groups to be Al-Qaeda when they really have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and are no legitimate threat to the United States.
And he also pointed out that the Boston bombing, for example, Al-Qaeda didn't directly have anything to do with it. Neither did it have to do anything with Benghazi. So, Andrea, how do you take Lawrence's argument and how do you put it in perspective of what's happening around the world?
I think what the president was trying to do, although in a flawed way, was to say that this idea we've had for 12 years that the U.S. is at war with a concept, that has to go. The U.S. can't claim that it's on a perpetual war footing. That's not something the American people want. It's certainly not something that U.S. allies want around the world. But at the same time, he acknowledged that terrorism poses a serious threat to U.S. citizens and people around the world. So no one is suggesting that there shouldn't be attempts to stop terrorism, that people shouldn't be prosecuted if they commit terrorist acts. But the idea that the U.S. is just going to be engaged in a war that never ends is one that it is really high time to end that.
Okay, so we have two critics of the president who disagree with each other, so that's an interesting panel. He put forward a strategy of how we should move forward, and I think the front and center from what I got was no boots on the ground, we're drawing down on Afghanistan, but one thing that he really put an emphasis on was drone strikes. He wants drones to be the front and center. I want to listen to how he defends drone strikes, because I know, Andrea, I've talked to you before that you're really against them, so let's listen to the president on drones.
To begin with, our actions are effective. America's actions are legal. So this is a just war, a war waged proportionally, in last resort, and in self-defense.
Effective, legal, and a last resort, self-defense. Andrea, what do you say?
I wish we knew, but the Obama administration has kept all of this information secret. We don't understand the framework in which they're fighting. We don't know who is being targeted. We don't know why. We don't know who is being killed, how many civilians are being killed. Perhaps if we had that information, we could then really decide whether what the president explained is the case.
Didn't he say, though, Congress is briefed on every strike, Lawrence?
And I suspect that's true to some extent. I'm sure there's limited briefings and they are private and all the rest. You know, it's interesting. I obviously disagree with Andrea, but from a completely different perspective. I take her point that the more things are secretive, the more that there will be civilian deaths that we don't know about, there will be collateral damage that we don't know about, and it is somewhat troubling. On the other hand, I was struck by the fact that he spoke about drones and almost nothing else. We certainly want to prevent there being more boots on the ground, if at all possible. But I was once again struck by the fact that to put so much emphasis on drones as part of our next strategy and not to think more creatively about other things that we need to do. And I do think it comes back to ideology in terms of fighting a war of ideas so that there's less appeal for these extremist thoughts, or, with all due respect, radical Islamic thought, I think was really striking. It's a hole in that speech that he really didn't address.
Do you agree that he put too much emphasis on drones, and what else could he have instead of drones?
Well, I was actually heartened to hear, perhaps for the first time from such a senior official in the U.S., discussion about other ways to engage in countries where people are susceptible to joining terrorist groups. There are certain people who are going to want to commit crime no matter what anyone does. But the president actually recognized that there may be economic and social factors at play in a number of the countries where people are joining terrorist groups, and said, quite frankly, Americans don't want to spend money on foreign aid, but perhaps we need to. So I thought that was important, but as with everything the president said in his speech, the implementation is what matters, and we don't yet know how he will implement any of these bold ideas.
And now, you said he put too much emphasis on drones. He's explained in his speech why drones may be the only alternative in certain places. Let's listen to the president, then we'll talk about it. Let's listen to what he says.
Where foreign governments cannot or will not effectively stop terrorism in their territory, the primary alternative to targeted lethal action would be the use of conventional military options.
So if we don't have drone strikes, we have to send in military. Andrea, what do you say to that?
It really depends on the circumstances. I mean, what is the determination that this person poses such a serious threat to the U.S. that they need to be killed, essentially? I mean, the U.S. is working closely with a lot of foreign allies to work to arrest people who are attempting to commit crimes.
But he's saying in places where foreign governments cannot or will not act. Do you think that's a legitimate reason for drone strikes, Lawrence?
To the extent that U.S. interests are at stake, to the extent that U.S. national security is at stake.
And who defines that, though?
Well, look, clearly this is a matter of judgment, and it is not something that we can pull a definition off of a bookshelf and implement the same definition in every case. So in terms of who decides U.S. national security, of course the United States decides U.S. national security in collaboration as much as possible with our allies as we possibly can. But of course it's a judgment call, and at the end of the day, we may be the leader of the free world, but at the end of the day, we also have to look after our own interests, so it's a judgment call.
Andrea, do you see the president trying to walk a very delicate line here? He wants U.S. to look like it's a law-abiding country, and he talks about drones, which some countries in the world have problems for. Do you think he succeeded?
You know, I think he has a huge problem, right? The president, I think it was clear he was reflecting on his own moral concerns about U.S. counterterrorism operations. And he wants to be seen as a president who is just. I mean, he said in his speech that this war is a just war. That's a very bold statement. And the key factor that was sort of left out, although the president discussed it, is even if some of these strikes are lawful, even if they are targeted, even if they are only killing people who are really about to launch attacks against the U.S., what are the consequences of that? What happens to the local population? How do people respond to that? Do they respond by taking up arms, by feeling that the U.S. is now their enemy if it wasn't before? And that's a huge concern that the president did refer to, but I think that has to be looked at a lot more closely when thinking about the future of U.S. counterterrorism activities.
Now, he mentioned a couple of other constitutional issues, and I want to come to them, but it's time to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Voice of America, 1,500 hours
of news and information,
educational and cultural programming
to more than 134 million people
worldwide each week.
Listen to us on radio.
Watch us on television.
Follow us on Facebook or Twitter.
And through your mobile device. VOA.
We're dynamic
and consistent
in bringing you
the most reliable information in 43 languages.
Tune in.
Tune in.
Welcome back to On the Line. I'm Aisha Tanzim. We're talking about America's next step in the war on terror. With us in studios are Andrea Prasow, Senior Counterterrorism Counsel at the Human Rights Watch, and Lawrence Haas, former Communications Director for the Clinton White House and now a Senior Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council. The President said, Lawrence, in his speech, we must define the conflict or it will define us. And he seemed to be reflecting at some of the human rights things that Andrea has mentioned. You're saying it's not time to wind down the war. If you were still his communications director, what would you suggest to him?
Well, you look at the nature of the threat and you respond in as appropriate a way you can to, on the one hand, be effective in terms of targeting the enemy, and on the other hand, take account of a lot of the concerns that Andrea has raised today. What's the impact on innocent civilians? What's the impact, the long term, on the relationship with that country that either is or is not harboring actively those terrorists? Now, I can't tell you precisely what I'd be advising the president because I'm not privy to the intelligence. All I can tell you is that war is a balancing act. How hard to go, how soft to go, what are the short-term needs, what are the long-term consequences? And my advice to the president would be as thoughtful as you can, make sure that you take account first and foremost in protecting U.S. national security, but at the same time, obviously be very sensitive to the world in which we're heading and the world that we want to create in the future.
And now, don't you think he did that? And I want to ask you, Andrea, don't you think he did that a little bit with saying we cannot torture people, we want to close down Gitmo, we want to improve our image, we want to tell people Islam's not at war with the U.S.? Or do you think he failed somewhere in there?
You know, the president essentially led by saying that the U.S. had tortured its enemies. And that was actually a huge part of the speech that hasn't been discussed very much because there was so much else that was incredibly important in the speech. But I thought that was a very bold statement by the president. I do hope he follows that up with some action, though. The Senate Intelligence Committee in the U.S. has conducted a thorough review of the CIA's detention and interrogation program, essentially the CIA's torture program. There's a 6,000-page report that's classified. And I hope that one day soon we'll hear the president say, part of how we move on from that time is by disclosing this information to the public.
Okay, now one constitutional issue, and we've been talking about drones, is drone strikes on American citizens. Before we go on, let's hear the president.
When a U.S. citizen goes abroad to wage war against America and is actively plotting to kill U.S. citizens, and when neither the United States nor our partners are in a position to capture him before he carries out a plot, his citizenship should no more serve as a shield than a sniper shooting down on an innocent crowd should be protected from a SWAT team.
This was a big issue when Anwar Awlaki was killed because he's a citizen. Andrea, do you agree with the president or you have a problem with his statement?
Well, it's clear that under international law, citizenship is essentially irrelevant. If someone is on the other side of a fight, they can be killed, assuming that they're targeted lawfully. But there are valid questions under U.S. constitutional law that constitutional experts have addressed, and I think the president sort of alluded to that in his speech. The basic framework is that it's the same standard, but if there are additional requirements under U.S. law, that's something that he's interested in exploring, and he sort of raised the idea of the so-called drone court and then dismissed it, and a couple of other ideas that I think we'll hear come up again.
Lawrence, he also talked about Gitmo, or Guantanamo detention facility, a lot. And that's been one of his things right from the beginning. He campaigned on it, he tried to close it, failed. He's bringing it up again. Do you think he'll succeed this time where he failed before?
I don't. This is one of the unfortunate promises that he made when he was running for president, because it wasn't thought through in terms of what's the next step. Okay, we want to close Guantanamo Bay. Fine. What are we going to do exactly with the people there? Are their host countries going to take them? Are other states in the United States going to take them? Nobody wants these people because they're extremely dangerous. So you have to answer that question in terms of what's next. He never got to an answer that would satisfy anybody, and I don't detect he's going to get to one this time.
But didn't U.S. Already have people in court that were extremely dangerous? Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, and Abdul Muttalib, one of the Al-Qaeda operatives. Andrea, you've worked extensively on this issue. What do you think?
Well, not only can U.S. courts handle people who are extremely dangerous, very few people in Guantanamo are extremely dangerous. Keep in mind there are 166 men there right now. 86 of them were identified for transfer out of Guantanamo by an interagency task force that included all of the intelligence agencies. They were identified for transfer 3 years ago. Yet the only reason they're sitting in Guantanamo now is because of politics.
Why do you think people feel that U.S. courts cannot or should not handle these people?
Well, I agree with the point being made that U.S. courts have had some success in the past, for sure, in terms of prosecuting. I think there is concern that when you decide wholesale that you're going to bring all of these enemy combatants into U.S. courts, that you are going to, in essence, give them rights that they are not necessarily due under normal conventions of warfare. After all, they're not criminals. They are in essence, war fighters. And so that has been a major concern. And, frankly, I can see both sides of this argument very well. But if you're asking me why this has been a concern, I think that's been the major concern.
Now, the president also expressed a different kind of concern. If we keep holding these people, let's listen to what the president is worried about.
Imagine a future 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, when the United States of America is still holding people who have been charged with no crime on a piece of land that is not part of our country. Look at the current situation, where we are force-feeding detainees who are being held on a hunger strike. Is this who we are? Is that something our founders foresaw? Is that the America we want to leave our children?
There are already people that have been detained for years and years, Andrea, without charge. Do you see, is this possible, what the president is worried about?
This is sort of the most frustrating part about the president's speech. The people who are being held without charge are being held without charge because he's approved it. When the president took office and gave his bold National Archives speech 4 years ago, which was meant to be sort of the bookend, this speech, these are the two bold speeches on counterterrorism of his presidency, he adopted this view that the Bush administration had accepted, that there were people who were allegedly too dangerous to release but could not be prosecuted. He is the one who made this decision. He can change it. It requires some political will, it requires some risk, but this is up to him.
Well, given what Andrea said, how much of this speech was rhetoric and how much of it was substance?
Well, it left me frustrated for this reason as well as others. The president does have a tendency to, in essence, make legitimate points, but then not take them to their closing point. Because in essence, what Andrea is saying is, he doesn't have the therefore. Therefore, we will do what? And I think her point is well taken. There was a lot of rhetoric without getting to the next step. I do want to go back to, as much as I know Andrea disagrees, with getting to the next step in terms of defining the enemy. I agree with Andrea, it is not terror, but there is something we're fighting. It is an ideology. He never once mentioned it, and he never once mentioned state sponsors of terrorism. And I found those to be two glaring holes in a speech that was supposed to be about a new counterterrorism policy.
So we're now talking about, therefore, what next? He mentioned that he wants to make sure that the people know that U.S. is not at war with Islam.
Right.
You're saying a lot that he did not define the enemy, but isn't it an elusive enemy? The more you try to define it, the more you're in that cycle of creating more enemies?
Look, I think that the president, just like earlier presidents in other wars, have defined the nature of the enemy, whether it was an ideology, as it was during the Cold War, whether it was particular countries, as during the Cold War, who were propelling this ideology, the Soviet Union being the best example, where he can speak openly about it. You're right, we're not at war with Islam, and I would never suggest we are. But are we at war in many ways with radical Islamist ideology? Yes, absolutely, and I see no reason why the president cannot draw distinctions between our values and the values being propagated by those who would commit terrorist acts against the United States.
Well, I wish we had more time to talk about this. The speech had so much in it. I just wish we had more time, but our time's up. I really want to thank our guests, Andrea Prasow, Senior Counterterrorism Counsel at the Human Rights Watch, and Lawrence Haas, former Communications Director for the Clinton White House and now a Senior Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Institute. And thank you for joining us. Please send us your questions or comments or watch our past shows on our website, voanews.com/ontheline. We look forward to hearing from you and hope you'll join us again next week for another episode of On the Line.
North Carolina buys 5.6 billion gallons of liquid fuels annually, and the goal of the state's strategic plan for biofuels leadership is that by the year 2017, 10% of liquid fuels, about 600 million gallons of fuel, will come from biofuels locally grown and produced. To reach this goal, North Carolina's General Assembly created the Biofuel Center to develop a state biofuels industry and reduce this dependence. The center is the nation's first agency to address comprehensively all aspects of long-term biofuel development within a state. Stephen Burke is its president.
Our approach is to look at the very landscape of North Carolina, our fields, our farms, our roads, the persons who drive vehicles on those roads, our universities, our policymakers, and say to each of them, changes are going to come about in the next years.
As a renewable, clean-burning fuel that also lowers tailpipe emissions, biodiesel is produced from a variety of feedstocks, such as soybeans, waste vegetable oil, animal fats, and recycled cooking fats. But in this field, scientists are revealing the potential of forestry feedstocks as an energy source.
Realistically, in a state rich in forest resources, with 18 million acres of forested land, we anticipate that trees, forest materials, cellulosic biomass will be our greatest resource. Fortunately, our forest resources are so great in amount that we can add biofuels to our resources as a whole new sector. Probably realistic first pass estimate is that within 15 years, 2/3 of our biomass in this state will come from forest and cellulosic materials.
North Carolina poplar trees show great potential as a source for biofuels. The tree grows 12 feet a year, matures in less than 4 years, and can reach a total height of up to 100 feet. Poplar trees' fast growth means that it could be a steady source of biomass in managed forests. Yellow poplar is most abundant and reaches its largest size in North Carolina's mountains.
Biofuels, new around the world, is only now being seen in North Carolina, and I hope elsewhere, as so extraordinarily important a topic and indeed an endeavor. It is our learning so far that North Carolina is unique in trying to put all of these pieces in a cohesive framework. In North Carolina, we are fortunate. Our growing conditions enable us to grow throughout our state a very wide range of biomass sources, some appropriate to yield biodiesel, some appropriate to yield bioethanol. And the list is perhaps greater in this state than is true in other places. Grasses, industrial sweet potatoes, canola, soybeans, in time algae, and trees and cellulosic biomass sources.
Yearly, North Carolina will need 228,500 acres of purpose-grown, fast-growth trees to reach its goal of 600 million gallons of homegrown biofuels per year.
Every day, she fights an incurable disease that can literally take her breath away.
You're like, okay, this needs to stop because I can't breathe. I'm just coughing.
Next on Discoveries and Breakthroughs, see how this young woman is making every breath count in the battle to stop cystic fibrosis in its tracks. For 28-year-old Mindy Seiler, something as simple as a breath of fresh air can trigger a debilitating attack.
You're like, okay, this needs to stop because I can't breathe. I'm just coughing.
For all her life, Mindy's battled cystic fibrosis and symptoms that frequently put her in the hospital.
My stays range from 23 days all the way up to 55 days, depending on how bad my lungs are.
In CF, a chemical imbalance causes a buildup of mucus that blocks vital airways inside the lungs.
What happens with CF is they don't have as much chloride on the top side of cells in their lungs, actually throughout their body, and that causes a drying of the lungs.
Tracking that drying generally involves an invasive test called a bronchoalveolar lavage. Under general anesthesia, a tube sprays fluid into the lung. The fluid is removed and tested for key inflammatory biomarkers.
Nice, relaxed breathing.
Now, pharmacists and medical experts at the University of Arizona are working on a new test, analyzing the tiny atoms exhaled by the patient to check the wet or dryness of the lungs. The goal, a less invasive test that could lead to better management of CF.
I would hope eventually, as it's fine-tuned, a more regular test. I tell people kind of like a glucometer for diabetics to see if any of the markers are going up before pulmonary function declines.
Mindy knows she can't stop her CF, but she's one young woman who's not giving up.
As long as I'm here, I'm going to fight and do everything I can to live as long as possible.
I'm Alex Kane reporting.
Schools and office buildings are the world's biggest producers of electronic waste. It is important for any school or business to pursue the correct avenues for e-waste disposal so that discarded devices don't finish up in landfills or solid waste streams to be broken down in environmentally irresponsible ways. When discarding e-waste, check if the manufacturer has a take-back program, and if not, you should then find your closest legitimate e-waste recycler to safely dispose of your device.